How's everyone doing? All right, so obviously this is very last minute. I have no slides or anything like that, but so I guess I'll start off with kind of giving you the idea of what I wanted to accomplish. I wanted to do this for question.
Who are you?
Oh, sorry, James Bauer, just a normal InfoSec nerd, and I got an interest in I basically have done stuff. I started doing network penetration testing, and then I moved on to AppSec, and then I started to do some threat hunting for a while, and now I actually have a role doing threat intelligence. But one of the things I've always kind of wanted to do was, because I find myself going back and doing small kind of pen test here or there, or just being curious about, infrastructure for maybe like a C2 or something. So the idea that I always kind of had was I would do all these kind of things that would be manual kind of over and over again, kind of like the same methodologies, and I'd be running through my, my list of the things I want to accomplish. Like, you have an IP, I might want to look up like the AS information associated with it, or on like the web application side, doing like simple recon. So kind of where I wanted to go, I was always kind of looking for a way of, how can I build something that will go ahead and, I can simply just give it a domain or an IP, and it'll just take it off from there. Whether or not that's, but I wanted something that would automate that and then scale it out, essentially indefinitely. And then so it wasn't actually until, and I tried, taking Python and, doing all that stuff, but the problem was it's like I'm using, multiple tools that are written in everything from Bash to Python to Ruby, and the output is totally different. Some is going to be just, XML, other parts are just going to be JSON, some of it's just, flat text, and combining that all together. And I just couldn't come up with, I was always just scratching my head I'd get like a little bit further, but I just couldn't really get anything going. So it really wasn't until about 6 months ago that I was looking into more stuff, and I kind of stumbled across like DevOps stuff. And so I was looking at a few DevOps solutions, and what I actually ended up settling on was GitLab pipelines. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with how pipelines work. It's essentially pretty easy. I mean, you're setting up, it's really just a YAML file. But it's all based off of containers, which at the time, for a security perspective, I really wasn't too big into containers, particularly like Docker containers. I'd used them before, but I never really had like a great purpose for them, so I was like, all right, whatever. But then as I started looking into the DevOps side, which is pretty much all based off of containers for the most part, it started to get kind of cool. So the first thing I kind of wrote for a pipeline is like, okay, let's say you create a Jira ticket, or you do a commit in a GitHub repo, like whatever you have that can essentially kick off like a webhook. It's pretty much all you need. So when I first started, I basically created a text file in a GitHub repo, and I would put in a domain name. And from there, essentially what I had to do was like the webhook goes to essentially like GitLab, and that kicks off my, trying to think how I should structure this. When you do like the pipeline, you can break the pipeline down into what's called stages, and those stages can either run in parallel, or they can run one right after another. And so depending on what you want. So like the first thing I would do is I created a container, like just a Docker container that had Masscan in it. And I basically have my GitLab pipeline. When it starts off, it basically like takes that domain name and just does a dig on it to get the IP address from it. It takes that, because if you guys are familiar with Masscan, it needs an IP. Feeds that IP into it. Masscan takes that, dumps out that information, into XML, which is then actually fed into Nmap. And so these are happening, one right after the other. And then, but the interesting thing is that what I did was when MassScan gets the IP and it starts doing its TCP port scan across, all 65,000, I also have Unicorn doing the UDP scan at the same time in parallel. Because what happens is these are actually different containers, and so they're actually different IPs. And so the cool thing about this type of solution is, and what I got really excited about is that depending on how you set this up, I never have to be worried about being blocked, because the pool of IPs is huge. And there's tons of ways that you can set that up. I mean, just depending on how you want to build your infrastructure. You can essentially have it where you could literally kick off a container that will be spun up in, as a small little, EC2. And every time you do a job, it's going to kick up a new one. And, so that's going to be a different IP. So you never have to worry about, being, scanning from home or scanning from your, a VPS that you have or a box that you have on a network somewhere, which for me is kind of cool. But the good thing about it is that the way that queues work in pipelines, so let's just say that we, our whole thing that we want to do is we just want to basically do MassScan to do all the, to do all the ports, feed the open ports to Nmap, and then Nmap would do a more intensive scan on each port, looking for the particular service and sending back that information to you or storing it. And so the cool thing about using pipelines, and this is where the DevOps stuff really starts to become cool, is that the way that the queues work is I could give it one domain, or I could give it, I could give it an entire, wildcard subdomain. I can say, hey, whatever, here's 4,000 yahoo.com domains. And for each one, it will kick off a separate pipeline. And those are all running in parallel. Not like, obviously not all thousands of them, it depends on your resources, but you could have anywhere from 1 to 10 or 20 running at the same time. And then what happens, at least in my pipelines, is after Nmap does like a more specific scan on those individual ports, it then takes that data, drops it into, it sends it on forward, but at the same time, it sends that data to an S3 bucket. And then I actually have Splunk go out to S3 every few minutes and grab that and import it into my dashboard. So once it does that, and then at the same time, I hope you guys can see that the scaling is amazing, but then also being able to do so many things in parallel, that you just could not, you'd always be doing those things linearly, when you're manually doing it, which is what I've just done for so many years. So, then after it basically gets those ports, it basically just greps that out and says like, hey, are there any, HTTP ports? If there are, I say, oh, well, hey, send it over to another pipeline I have sitting over here just waiting, and send a webhook over there with some information containing, the domain and the port, and have WhatWeb grab just back some basic information about it. And then WhatWeb basically does that, takes it, puts it out as, I have it going to JSON, which again goes to an S3 bucket, which goes back into Splunk, which also then says like, hey, if WhatWeb comes back with certain things, then go ahead and kick off, GoBuster on that and start doing directory brute forcing. And then take that information, send it to another S3 bucket, that'll go back into Splunk. And so what's really cool is that it just starts to, you put in one piece of information, and then you're literally looking at a dashboard that just starts to populate like crazy with all this information. And like I said, depending on your resources and budget, I mean, you can talk about, you're talking about scanning potentially, dozens of domains or IPs all at the same time, all in parallel. And that information, but it just doesn't stop from there. So essentially what happens after GoBuster finds particularly, and then what I've also kind of done was, I have jobs that run, because you can have pipelines that run on schedules. So for instance, there are a few people on the internet that have really great word list. And so what I have it do is, on the schedule, I say, hey, every night at midnight, go to their GitHub repos, download their latest word list for whatever, plus mine and my private GitHub repo that I personally like, combine it all together, do a unique sort, and then basically store it in this GitHub repo. and it does that on schedule every single night. Well, like when GoBuster basically kicks off, the first part of that code that I have in that YAML file basically says, hey, GoBuster, go here and download my personal word list from my private GitHub repo that's the collected of all the stuff that I really like, and use that when you're doing your directory brute forcing. And so the part of the schedules is pretty cool as well, because it's like you can constantly keep all this stuff updated, because I don't know about you guys, but things like word list and stuff I usually update them right before I need them, and I'm going out looking for, like, is there anything newer or cooler or what? Or, like someone will have something in, and it's the same thing for payloads. I have a schedule that does payloads for like cross-site scripting, because people will come out with something, like somebody put something on Twitter the other day, which was like a really nice WAF bypass for cross-site scripting. And I was like, oh, that's really great. So I, added that to my own personal like little list. And so again, like payloads, dictionaries, you can run these pipelines and just have it go out and get all this stuff, put it together, combine it, sort it, do everything you want, put it up to your own personal, then upload it to your repo. And so whenever you call jobs or you're doing anything, it's like that it's always up to date. And then of course, if you want to get more complicated with it, you can go ahead and take you can have notifications. So basically, sometimes I'll have notifications either go directly to like a Slack channel that says like, hey, the word list, updated or whatever. And then there's also like emails in case something happens, like, hey, it failed for, whatever particular reason. But what's really interesting is, and this is why I always like kind of, that's why I was kind of really curious about this talk, about how people are getting like further than that, because the use cases get like incredibly complicated when you go past, just like directory brute forcing. Like when you start to make actual logic, even just actually like when you start to do tons and like thousands of IPs, just doing Nmap stuff, and then you try to keep. That's why Splunk is great, and I'm a big Splunk guy, because I like being able to throw in just tons of different data and different data sources, and have Splunk be able to go ahead and handle it regardless of if the data changes over time, and I don't have to worry about it. But let me see if I can think of a real good way of. So the potential is pretty amazing to me. Especially on and I haven't met too many people that are, a lot of, especially on the the dev SecOps stuff, it's more like we have this code, we're a software company, we do a commit, it basically will kick off, some tool of a scanner that's going to scan that for, could be, HP, whatever, and it's going to look for, vulnerabilities in this code, and if it does, it'll fail the job, or if it doesn't, it'll go ahead and push it, and but being able to take that and actually start to do like a lot more technically difficult things beyond just like I'm sure I can give you another example. Like, so the way that I also have it is I basically have I have this all split up, which is kind of like happening all in the background in parallel, like I said, which is, if it finds an interesting, like let's say I do a brute force directory and it comes across, something like a, my PHP admin, I can basically have that kicked off to basically find, the version of that, and then it basically uses like the API for something like vulners, or, there's a lot of those now. They're basically like, hey, here's the version that it was grepped out. Is that vulnerable? If it is, okay, great. Because and I guess this is kind of where I should have started, but like I said, I wasn't prepared for this. But so, because my thing is, it's like I'm not trying to basically make this completely, autonomous, hack all things kind of thing. What I'm really trying to do is, if I only have an allotted amount of time, like let's say that I have like 2 hours tonight to hack or do whatever, like I want to be as efficient as possible. I want to basically look at a list or have alerts that basically say like, hey, spend your time on these URLs or these domains or these IPs in this software right here. And this is where, and so that's where my machine learning is going to start coming in, is that I'm going to have these basically quantified entries of this is where I should spend my time at, and then as I'm doing manual things on there, like let's say that I'm running Burp Suite and I'm doing all the stuff, that's all going back into Splunk, and then as I actually begin to find vulnerabilities that are not false positives and are actually executable, that data feeds back into it to make the decision of like, well, hey, here's a cross-site scripting vulnerability that actually worked in here. what other, out of all the domains that we've looked at, what other URLs are similar to that, and let's try that same payload in those ones and record the results out of it. And so it's kind of like, imagine if you had all of your pen tests from all of the years, like every tool that you ran in a central location, and every time you do or learn something cool, it can literally go back and try it on all the previous stuff that closely matches what you're looking at, like what you're working on right now. So that's kind of like the idea of it's really just about like efficiency. It's not about I really want it to have just the highest probability of, I'm going to be able to spend 2 minutes and say, yes, this is vulnerable to this. This is right here. Great. Move on to the next one. Move on to the next one, rather than having to spend so much time, just working on recon and scanning and stuff like that, and sitting there waiting for tools to run. So yeah, I guess that's it. So hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.